Hi everyone, welcome to Round the Table. It's good to see you. We missed last week, but here we are. And we are in Mark chapter 5, and we are going to be reading from verse 21. So I shall just bring that up. Right. Edmund, would you like to read from your Jewish version?
Down to where?
Actually, why don't you go right to the very end? Yeah, let's go right to the very end.
Okay, yeah, that I can do. Yeah, I like it doing longer chunks. Right. Yeshua crossed in the boat to the other side of the lake, and a great crowd gathered around him. There came to him a synagogue official, Jairus by name, who fell at his feet and pleaded desperately with him, "My little daughter's at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she'll get well and live." He went with him, and a large crowd followed, pressing all around him. Among them was a woman who'd had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had suffered a great deal under many physicians. She'd spent her life savings, yet instead of improving, she'd grown worse. She'd heard about Yeshua, so she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his robe. For she said, "If I touch even his clothes, I will be healed." Instantly, the hemorrhaging stopped, and she felt in her body that she'd been healed from the disease. At the same time, Yeshua, aware that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples responded, "You see the people pressing in on you, and still you ask who touched me?" But he kept looking around to see who'd done it. The woman, frightened and trembling because she knew what had happened to her, came and fell down in front of him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your trust has healed you. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And while he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house came, saying, "Your daughter's died. Why bother the rabbi any longer?" Ignoring what they had said, Yeshua told the synagogue official, "Don't be afraid, just keep trusting." He let no one follow him except Peter, Jacob, and John, Jacob's brother. And when they came to the synagogue official's house, he found a great commotion with people weeping and wailing loudly. On entering, he said to them, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's just asleep." And they jeered at him, but he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." At once, the girl got up and began walking around. She was 12 years old. Everybody was utterly amazed. He gave them strict orders to say nothing about this to anyone and told them to give her something to eat.
Excellent. Thank you, Edmund. Hi, Sigun, welcome. We think you're there, Sigun. So, just to remind people.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, hi, Sigun. It's good to see you.
Hi, Sigun.
Hi, good evening, everybody.
So 2 weeks ago, we looked at Jesus. Well, over the last sort of 2 and 3 weeks ago, we looked at the beginning of this whole section, starting where Jesus and the disciples were crossing the sea, and the storm came up, and Jesus quelled the storm. And then when they landed on the other side, the Gerasene demoniac, and Jesus cast out the legion of demons, and the demoniac pleaded to go with him, but he said, "No, go and share with your family and friends and tell them what God has done for you." And then they cross over the sea again, and we enter this section of the story. So quite interesting. It's a one really long passage where Jesus is confronting having a number of power encounters against Satan, and really putting a stake in the ground. So, controlling the storm, casting out the demons, and now we're moving into healing sickness and raising the dead. So quite a powerful section. Before we get into the detail, have you anything you want to add or bring to that, Edmund?
Just to say that when he went over to to where the pagans were, which if you remember, I said was known as the land of the seven, one of there, meaning they were not Jewish. This is known. Now he's come back to this side, and these were, we would call them very evangelical Jews, if you like. They're a very strong spiritual commitment, the people in this area. So he's back among his own people, and that's known as the land of the 12 in comparison with the land of the 7, 12 being the Jewish number. Just to say that bit. So he's back in home territory, and crowds are still gathering.
Right. So Jesus crosses over the lake, large crowd gathering, and then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she will be healed and live. So Jesus went with him. So obviously the leader in the community, desperate to get help for his young daughter. And obviously shows that there were amongst the sort of leaders, spiritual leaders in the area, there were people who had faith in Jesus, who didn't see him as a threat, saw him for who he was, for the Son of God, as a holy man. Any comments on that, Edmund?
Yes. I was rather surprised to discover in Greek, it's a synagogus, the synagogue ruler. And in point of fact, contrary to what I've always grown up with, and all of us have grown up with, the ruler of the synagogue was not a spiritual leader. If you imagine that the synagogue was the centre where everything went on, including the religious stuff, anything that was needed in the community, education happened there. If there were mums who'd just given birth, well, it was all sorted out to sort out parcels for them in the synagogue. And the synagogus is that. He's the one who runs all that happens in the synagogues and puts up rotas. He's like Rosie with bells on.
Rosie with tassels.
Rosie, where? With tassels, yes. Yeah. So he's not a theologian. He wouldn't be part of teaching scriptures or anything like that. He's the official that makes sure everything works and all the things happen on every day as they should do. And he'll put up the rotas for who's to read from the scrolls and all that sort of thing. He just makes sure it all works. But it's a community leader. He is a community leader, but he's not a religious leader. That was the thing that I thought was new to me and would be new to us.
Who were the religious leaders in the synagogue then?
They would be, they'd be this is something I've been digging around for a while just recently. The elders, they sit in the chief seats, Jesus talks about them, and the elders are the people which the local community, everybody knows, these are the ones who seem to know the God stuff, and if we've got questions, those are the people we go to. And often that meant it was older members of the community, which is why they're called that. But there are examples of quite young elders because people recognised this person's got it, but it would be the community. They weren't elected by other elders. it emerged, and it was often the same with the rabbi, because it wasn't an official, you didn't get a sort of ordination to be a rabbi. You were just, it was recognized the one who taught. Often the rabbi would be in charge of the education in the schoolroom for the children. He would organize that. But that would be, but you would expect a rabbi to have a normal job. He might be a stonemason, he might be a builder, he might be all sorts of things. It was not approved of for someone, as they called it, to use the Torah as a spade to dig with. He didn't get his money by being a teacher of the Torah. He was expected to have a day job.
Good. No separation of the sacred and the secular. That's what we like. Excellent.
Just a slightly different thought. I mean, the comment about Jairus going to Jesus. I mean, can we be sure that it was because he acknowledged Jesus' divinity and sent calling, or might it be just because, you know, this was the healer, the local healer who'd come along, and therefore this was an opportunity he couldn't turn down?
I think they'd probably be one and the same thing. Something that suddenly dawned on me a week ago was, you know, when Jesus went to Nazareth, and it says he could do no great miracles there except he healed a few people because of their lack of faith. And suddenly the question occurred to me, how would you see their lack of faith? And I suddenly realized what that's actually saying is, you know, if I hear that there's a famous guy who, Ian Andrews, well, you know, I've seen Ian Andrews operating, and when he says a thing, it happens. So if you know that Ian Andrews is coming, well, you're going to go there, aren't you? If you're in need. But when Jesus comes back to Nazareth, you could see they didn't have faith because, oh, no, I'm not going to bother. He's just Joseph's boy. We know him. Hear all this nonsense down in Capernaum. But they didn't believe it. So that's their lack of faith. If I hear about someone, and to be honest, Edmund needs his head sorting out because he's thinking, oh, I've heard all of that before, I'm not going to bother. That shows that I don't have faith at that point for that particular ministry. Do you see what I mean? I mean, the Lord, when I understood this, the Lord was really saying, oh, yes, and how often have you decided not to go to something because you think, oh, I've heard all this before? You're actually showing a lack of faith, Edmund. You don't actually believe. And yes, well, I had to, sort out some things inside myself. And it's a challenge to me in a way that it hasn't been before. How I react to different ministries will depend on how much faith I have. If I think, oh, there's a chance, and I rush off down there, that shows I have faith. The people in Nazareth, oh, no, he's just Joseph's boy. So very few people bothered to take their sick mother to him or whatever. Does that make sense?
And also, I think it says that he fell at his feet, so which is an act of worship, and you know and an act of submission. So you would fall at the feet of a king, or you'd fall at the feet of a god. But I don't know. Would you fall at the feet of a prophet? I'm not sure. I don't think so.
I think there may be the odd occasion in the Old Testament, but whatever you're doing, you're acknowledging, I am recognizing your authority, whatever that authority is. You have it, and we don't understand the honor thing properly. We talk about honor a lot, but we're not really doing what the Bible means about honor, which means that you submit yourself to that person and put them above you. You recognize their right to have authority over you by kneeling at their feet. And that's what you're doing, whether he's thinking about it in divine terms or whatever. The hot prophet, it's... he has authority, and Jairus is saying, I recognize that.
Hi, Eric.
I know who Eric is. Can you hear me?
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Welcome to Round the Table, Eric.
Thank you. I will just listen.
Okay. But if you have a question or if you have anything to share, if you have an insight, please feel free to join in.
Okay, thank you.
So Jesus goes with Jairus, and I don't think Jesus would go with someone if he had the wrong attitude to who Jesus was, because Jesus would have had insight to Jairus's heart and motivation. And if it was the wrong heart and motivation, Jesus would have teased out of him, where he was coming from, what his position was. Jesus was very good at just asking the right question to challenge someone, to encourage them. And we'd have no record of that. And it's a very detailed telling of the story, very obviously from an eyewitness. So Jesus goes with him, a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And then the woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She'd suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. So obviously a terrible, illness for her, but also a double-handed problem, because it also made her unclean. So she would have been unclean for 12 years, and having put herself under doctors and spent her money, people would have been aware that she was unclean. So Edmund, have you anything to bring on?
Yeah,
her position.
Yeah, what would normally happen in a family during a monthly period was that very often they had a separate room with that you would stay in while you were going through that time each month, called Niddah in Hebrew. And there were a whole lot of things around it, how you were supposed to keep yourself, as it were, from rendering other people unclean. So the problem is that she's not allowed to be touched under general circumstances. I mean, you could touch them if they were ill, but that would mean you would be unclean and what have you. So it doesn't mean she doesn't get any care at all, but it's a quite deliberate, in so doing, I am willing to be unclean for you. And that might, that's not something that's unlikely, but generally it means you have to avoid touching people. And to be in that situation, I mean, it's constantly there. It's like, if you've got AIDS or something, people used to feel when you talk to people who had AIDS, particularly back, that, Princess Diana was famous because she broke a taboo by touching, I've forgotten his name, but that whole thing, that is very similar to the way she would feel in her community. And so it constantly, I mean, we talk about your mental state because of COVID. What's her mental state? 12 years of this. And there was a period of a number of years when I was growing up where my mum had all sorts of problems. And she was so tired all the time in this direction. And, pale and drawn and not really very well for an extended period of time. And I just, this poor woman, I just feel for her.
Can I just ask a question here?
Sure.
You just have to tell me if I'm very naive, okay? But I've read this for over 30 years now. the Bible, but not this. This is actual chapter about the woman with an issue of blood. Why is it that everybody assumes it's a period?
No, it isn't. It's
Well,
more.
not a period, but a bleeding. A bleeding.
I'm just saying what would happen under normal situations for a woman.
Sorry, if it was continuous bleeding she was having, why do we think it is part of the wound that is coming?
Rules are really about the problem of blood. It's blood that, I mean, inevitably, for the lasses, that's going to be a situation. But the problem is about blood. It's not about that under normal circumstances, a woman is going to have a monthly cycle. It's just that during that time, so that we don't compromise the environment, it's not a sin, you see, to be unclean. It's not a sin. We often confuse that. If you imagined that you had to go into an environment in the RUH, the operating theatre, well, we have to undergo certain protocols in order to go into that place. Like COVID has got all these protocols if we're going to be interacting with one another, yes? And you don't want to compromise those, and therefore you have to go through these protocols. It isn't a sin if you find, my shoes weren't properly clean when I stepped in here and I've compromised it. They're not going to tell you you've sinned or whatever if inadvertently you did something that compromised that situation, but they would have to clean it all in order to regain that situation. And that's what it means to be unclean. I mean, if you're a fisherman, almost inevitably, you are going to be unclean as far as the temple is concerned, but they wouldn't call you a sinner because working in that job, you can't avoid contact with things which would render you ritually, temple-wise, unclean. But he's not a sinner because he's a fisherman. It's just he can't maintain the integrity of the environment which God has set these boundaries around.
If it's an issue of blood.
Yeah.
Sue, I looked, whilst everyone was talking, I looked at the Greek word, and it means a flow of blood. So it's a feminine verb, and so it's a feminine flow of blood.
Oh right, so it's actually saying that, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it says subject to bleeding. It means subject to a flow, and it's a feminine flow. So I'm imagining that they've translated it to bleeding, but if you go back to the Greek, it's rusus. The word is rusis. It says rusis, a flowing, noun feminine, a flowing, an issue.
Yeah, that's the thing. We don't use the word in quite the same way, but in King James, you said, because that's what you grew up with, an issue of blood. And an issue, if you think of a magazine, what's the latest issue? What is the latest thing which has come out? So it has in the word a movement out, flow. But
so does that help? Does that help, Sue?
Yes, it does. In a way, it's just that I know of other diseases that can cause bleeding like that, or a flow of blood. But as you say, it's put it with the female anyway, so it's more likely to be what you've said.
I mean, if she'd have just been bleeding for 12 years, she would have likewise been unclean because of the blood.
Today, rather unexpectedly, I suddenly found I'd got blood on my hand, and I thought, where's that from? Eventually, I discovered it wasn't quite like a normal nosebleed, but something had happened, and out of nowhere, and it didn't seem to want to settle down, and it wasn't a lot, but that would have rendered me unclean immediately. I would have been, it's not just because she's a woman.
No.
The situation is the blood.
So it could have, if she'd have had a nosebleed for 12 years, then it would have had the same impact. But the Greek implies that it is her period flow. Second?
Yeah, I was going to add the same thing. I think, like Edmund said, it wasn't about, I think it just had to do with the way they handled the issue of blood. So hers was critical because it wasn't just maybe a monthly thing. It was continuous. So it meant, I mean, for example, I think in the Old Testament, I don't know if it was David and Bathsheba, and she was clean. So, I mean, the way you handled somebody who had any bit of blood, they had a special ritual that prevented them from getting involved in the regular activities so that they did not also get other people into that issue of blood. But with women, as in then, probably with the monthly cycle, probably it comes and it stops and they can go about their business because they are now clean. But because hers was continuous, it was an issue for her, and she actually couldn't do many things that no people could do.
So it says, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? It's a very interesting passage. Phil?
So just a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can.
Okay, sweet. So just for my contemplator, going back slightly, so Evan, were you saying that Jairus was the synagogueus? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, he's the synagogius. Yeah, synagogigus. Get my enough G's in there. Oh, by the way, something cropped up because I re-listened to something talking about Judaism, which was very tangled up and mixed up. And I re-listened to it yesterday, and it reminded me, I had seen it before, but I'd forgotten that you could actually have women leaders of synagogues, like Jairus. I definitely know of one in either Cyprus or Crete that is often quoted in the books. But I saw a completely separate thing referring to that in the Jewish annotated New Testament. And it was rabbis and whatnot who were doing the notes. And it mentioned synagogue people could be women as well. So Rosie could be
Synagogigus.
yes, she could be a synagogigus. Although I think if it's female, it's synagogissima or something like that.
So it's very interesting. Jesus had realized that the power had gone out from him. Edmund,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
Can I just back up just a couple of lines? It's really interesting. When she says, if I just touch, I can't remember what modern translations tend to blur it a bit. I can't remember what the one is, but if I touch his clothes, I shall be healed. She had a reason for saying that.
The hem of his gown.
It does say that. Is that?
No, I don't know. That's what I remember from the King James. If I said the hem of his gown.
I'm not sure if it's in Mark or if it's in one of the others. Well, hem of his gown, if you translate it back into the from the Greek into the original language, you get the corner of his robe or something like that. And there was a very common notion. They put together a number of verses that one of which you will know very well. He is risen with healing in his wings. Do you know that verse? Well, wings is the word, hope I get the right one here. I think it's kanaf in Hebrew. And that also means corner. What you do with, they debated for centuries, apparently, what is the corner of a round garment? And the rabbis are not sure. But the idea was it can mean wings and it can mean corner or edge. So when she's touching the edge of his garment, she's touching the kanaf and the thing which says he is risen with healing in his kanafs. And so they then deduced from that when our Messiah came, if you touched his tassels, you would be healed. And that was around in the atmosphere in Jesus's time. And it's that she knows about. So because she's therefore saying she thinks he's the Messiah, and therefore if I touch the fringe of his garment, I'm going to be healed. Right, now the question you asked me, sorry about that, but I just love that bit, that it's in there. By the way, when you pray in Jewish terms, you raise your arms. What happens to the garment that you're wearing if you're wearing a prayer shawl with tassels on it? Comes up like wings, and there are the tassels hanging down. So if you see a Jew praying with his prayer robe, with his arms up like that, he is he's doing exactly, he's risen with healing in his tassels. Okay, now, power had gone out of him, yes. It's an interesting one. Sometimes if you think about it, we've come across people where they're praying for somebody or they're encouraging us to pray. I used to see Ian Andrews do this, and he would, I remember with, he was trying to show Dave Jones about praying for somebody, and so he sat him down on a chair, and the person he had to pray for that had come out in answer to a word of knowledge, and he said, right, now put your hands on her head and pray. And Ian Andrews was standing behind Dave Jones, and I was watching Ian Andrews' face. And after a while, he began to look up into the air, sort of, almost as if he was whistling. And then he said, young man, just relax a bit. Now do it again. And I was watching his face. Dave rather more tentatively put his hand out instead of being the strong man about to do the healing, you know. And I watched Ian's face, and all of a sudden, he started to smile and nod. And he said, there you go, it's happened. He was aware when the Spirit of God moved. And I think that connected. I on occasion, I know when something has happened, when I'm praying for somebody. And I think Jesus would know that very much more powerfully than me, and would be aware, because where does the healing come from? By the Spirit of God, from Jesus. Therefore, he's going to feel it go. Just in the same way that Ian Andrews felt it when the Spirit moved on that person.
Excellent. And I checked in Matthew. It's in Matthew. It says she touched the fringe of his garment.
That's the talith. It's called the tassel of knots to remind them of their followers of God, and that they're given these guidelines for how to live, which we call laws.
Can I just quickly say something?
Yeah.
This is something that I painted in.
It looks just like them.
I didn't know really what I was painting. My explanation of it was slightly different to someone saying exactly what you've just been talking about, and that's it.
Yeah.
Did you see it coming from the light into the dark? I love that.
Yeah, because
risen with healing in his wings.
Yeah,
love that.
This is the bit that I felt was powerful, because when people are down there is a way up, and
yeah.
Yeah, his tassels come down into the dark to you.
Yeah.
The fringe comes down.
Yeah.
Excellent. There you go. See, you do the talking and Sue brings the visual aid. The picture that paints 1,000 words, Edmundo. Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" And earlier it says, a large crowd followed and pressed around him. So this was obviously, he wasn't just walking down the street with a crowd on either side of the road. They were up close, pushing. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Well, the amazing thing is that she had to come and speak out in front of everybody and explain what had happened. And then Jesus validated that she was healed. So this was Jesus declaring in front of all the people around, she's no longer unclean. So he was not just healing her physically, he was healing her position in the community as well. Edmund, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one little bit. The woman I've got here, frightened and trembling because she knew it happened to her. That frightened and trembling, this is the famous rabbi. And, the further up the scale you are, the more bothered you are about your position and whatnot. And she doesn't know how he's going to react to the fact that she's crept up on him to touch his tassel, because, they could get very stroppy, and she has no idea how he's going to react to her because she could be accused of contaminating him. And as he's such a holy figure, this is a big deal. And so his response, would have been amazing, because she was probably expecting to get thoroughly told off for what she'd done.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of many stories where Jesus shows that he doesn't hold any truck with the purity laws. Yeah. Time and again, we've got we'll be coming up to a few stories shortly, but time and again, Jesus does not have any issue with purity laws. So while Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" I mean, just can you imagine Jairus? It's like, he's managed to get Jesus, who's coming to his house, to heal his daughter. And then Jesus stops and starts having a discussion with someone. I mean, can you imagine the disappointment? And then, your daughter's dead. It's like, but if Jesus had not delayed, we could have got there in time. You can't really imagine what was going through Jairus's mind and emotions at that point. Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Now that is a big ask. Can you, your daughter's dead, don't be afraid, just believe. Ooh, if there's ever a time to pray, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief," that would be one of them, I think. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, which would have been it must have been quite forthright in his pronouncement, because there was a huge crowd pressing up against him just a couple of sentences ago. So for him to actually lay down the law and say, "No, don't follow me," he must have been quite strong. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. he went into them and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him, and laughed at is jeered, really. They were just like, you know, it wasn't a laughing, it was like a mocking. These would have been professional mourners who were paid to come and kind of get the atmosphere going. Edmund, have you got any background on these folk?
Just to say about Jesus saying, "Don't be afraid," you know, somehow or other, when Jesus speaks to you, even if it's Jesus's word to you, somehow in the midst of all sorts of things, somehow it becomes like an anchor. And he won't let what would normally cut into you hit you. And I'm saying that because of an experience. We had a remarkable African guy come to us some years ago called Benson Idahosa, who was famous for raising the dead and all sorts of things. And it was brilliant because he had he didn't dress as a Westerner, he had his proper gear on, you know, and it was, he came and people came from all over the place for that meeting. And I was sitting there, and all of a sudden, someone I'd known a very long time, ex-brethren, his name's gone. He was in the church for ages. Anyway, he, not his normal style, suddenly grabbed me as people were beginning to go up to the front and said, "I've been waiting for this for years." And he seized me and basically dragged me out to the front. I don't think under any circumstances he was not the sort of Kim Freeborn. He was not the sort of person to do something like that. You could see his brethren roots, even though he was happily charismatic. And he was always perfectly turned out in a suit and beautifully groomed and what have you. And to suddenly be seized by your friend, I'd known him before I ever joined the church and before he ever became charismatic. And he just sort of grabbed me, and I've been waiting for this. No question about, do you want to go? It was just, he dragged me out because he had such high expectations. And it just so happened that one of the visitors was another guy with cerebral palsy who was in a wheelchair. And so the two of us were thrust at Benson Idahosa. I think the other guy was intending to be there, but I was a bit bewildered because it just, just happening. And Benson Idahosa prayed over us, and he was very used in his culture to what was then going to happen. And it didn't exactly happen the same way here. And so he then turned to us and said, this is because whether it was to do with you're holding on to something, a spirit or something like that, or we were just being willful. But it was extraordinary because I felt, and this was the day before we used to fall over and be used to things like that, and I felt as if I was completely drunk inside. Everything was like happening at a great distance, and I was underwater, and I was tottering on my crutches back to feeling very unstable, tottering back to a chair. And he said, "Oh, these people haven't been healed because," and in fact, bless him, he misread the situation. The Lord explained to me afterwards. But instantly, the Lord was standing. It was like there was an arrow coming with his words that would hit me in the heart. And I was very vulnerable at that moment. I really was wide open. And instantly, the Lord was standing between me and Benson Idahosa with his back to Benson Idahosa. And the arrow went whack into Jesus. And the Lord said to me, pay no attention, that has nothing to do with you. Just like that. And somehow or other, I could hear the words, but it had no impact on me at all. But the word of the Lord, which is why I'm telling the story, the word of the Lord cut through everything else. And somehow, even if I understood nothing of what was going on, because I could hardly keep my feet. But somehow, pay no attention, that has nothing to do with you. And I was safe somehow. I was completely secure. No matter what was going on, I was safe. And that's what, when Jesus spoke to Jairus, he wouldn't understand, but Jesus is, I can, don't be afraid, just keep trusting. Cuts right the way through. He's holding Jairus in the midst of all of that. I'm absolutely convinced of that. Sorry, that was a preamble to your questions.
No, it's interesting. I know a lot of you weren't around a few weeks ago, but we were talking at one point about inner healing. And Edmund said he'd never really been into inner healing, but I think it's because it looks like God's done his inner healing as he's gone along rather than actually have to deal with it afterwards. Because that is inner healing, pure definition of Jesus speaking truth to you when there's been a word spoken over you. And God's obviously been very kind to Edmund and not allowed it to fester in his life, but dealt with it before it even landed. So Edmund, that's a perfect example of inner healing, mate. And I know you said you'd not really ever been through inner healing, but I think you've lived a life of inner healing. So there you go.
Oh, that's quite helpful, actually. I'd not thought of it that way round.
That is actually pure inner healing. So for Eric and Segon, who haven't actually met Edmund is in a wheelchair now. He used to be on crutches when we first knew each other, but he's now in a wheelchair. And so you too have cerebral palsy, don't you, Edmund?
Yeah.
But he also has the brain the size of a small planet.
The Great Commotion. You asked about the Great Commotion.
Yes, I asked about the professional whalers.
Yeah, you had them. There may have been some in amongst this crowd, but certainly all the relatives that relate to Jairus would have been aware that, and they would be all part of it. And once it was announced, that was part of responding to a death. So there would have been certainly professional, but I would think that most of them would be relatives and the immediate neighbours, because it was they're not just requiring to be paid for this. They would all know Jairus, and they would all know the little girl and whatnot. So I veer more towards the local community whaling.
Okay. But it's interesting when they laugh at him, because people say, oh, she wasn't really dead. People who try to say, oh, Jesus didn't really raise her from the dead. But they lived in a very different culture to ours, that they knew death. Yeah. We very rarely see death in our society because it's hidden away and sanitized from us. And, we have this, we just don't really experience it very often in our lives. But in that culture, they would have been very aware of death and what death looked like. And that's why it says they laughed at him, jeered at him, because it's like, are you kidding? We know she's dead. What are you talking about? Edmund, any comment on that?
No, I think that makes it. It'd be much. I'd say something very similar to that. That there isn't, people that say, "Oh well, Jesus." Well, I hear them all the time. Different coming up. Well, no, it's not really raising from the dead or whatever. And they knew what that was about. I mean, I was thinking of just been watching that Yorkshire Farm thing, and there are those children and the pet lamb. They'd looked after an injured lamb, and they were looking after it. It seemed to be doing all right, and it died. And the little 3-year-old looked and said, "Oh dear, he's not a happy lamb anymore. He's not a happy lamb. And his mum said, yeah, he's not happy anymore. Oh, well, she said, because they were all used to death and whatnot. And our culture is very odd. It doesn't seem to grasp death at all.
No, I'm sure, Segun, it's your culture. I mean, I don't know about West Africa, but I've got quite a lot of experience of East and Southern Africa, and people have a lot closer, more intimate experience of death in that culture. Not sure if Segun's still there. And then it says, after he put them all out, Jesus took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Edmund.
Just a little point that only just occurred to me as I ran it, because I've been thinking about, someone was talking about Jesus going to the Pharisee's house for dinner and the woman coming in. And you know, can you imagine in our place, you know, aren't the guys on the door checking things out? But in a Middle Eastern context, and I mean, Segun will know this, people wander in and out and all sorts of things. There's, if you like, almost public space in most houses, you know, whether it's the compound or whatever. And people are going in, and then there'll be inner places within that which are private to the family. But there's public space in houses. People are always in and out of one another's houses because their houses aren't like our little terraced house. And so they go in, and there's lots of people there, and then they go into the more private space. I'd not seen that before. There's two goings in. They go to the house, and then they go into the inner part of the house where the family's private places are. Just because it happens to be something I'm going through at the moment.
Yeah, that's very correct. It's almost like I think the culture came from the Israelites through the Arabs down to the Africans, you know, North Africa and down to the West. And yeah, that's how it is, you know. There are some places that only the family members see, you know. So, I mean, again, if you look at the Muslim culture, where their ladies are not allowed to remove their hair ties, or their hair are not allowed to be seen in public, you can only see maybe your mother. I mean, some women, only their husbands and maybe their kids have ever seen their hair, even though you have many other people living in the same compound. So yes, that's correct. It's a very good description of some environments down here.
I remember a quote from an ultra-Orthodox Jewish lady, and I don't know whether folk know, but if you go to the ultra-Orthodox in London and you see a Jewish lady, you're not actually looking at her hair because they all wear wigs.
Yeah.
And an old Jewish lady was boasting that only her husband and the roof beams had ever seen her hair.
Yeah, I do business in New York, and quite often we have Orthodox Jewish ladies coming by, and they all have exactly the same hairstyle, exactly the same color, exactly the same length, and you know, and it doesn't look very real. It looks like they're wearing a hairy hat in some ways, but yes, they all they look like they're chips off the same block. But yes, you don't see their hair. Interesting. I mean, it's not really that super relevant to the exegesis, but I just thought it was really curious, like the language of the age of the girl, and it says that the passage says that the girl was already a young daughter, and apparently up to 11 years and 1 day, a girl was regarded as a child. from 11 years and 1 day to 12 years and 1 day as underage, from 12 to 12 and a half years as a young daughter, and from 12 and a half years as an adult. And the distinctions were important in the determination of marriageable age. But it's just like so specific, up to 11 and 1 day, 11 1 day to 12 and 1 day, from 12 and 1 day to 12 and a half, and then over 12 and a half. 4 different terms for a girl in that period of life. I just thought that was just a fascinating detail. It's like, you know, they say the Eskimos have all these different words for snow, and the Jews had all these different words for a young girl. So that's just a curiosity.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. Well, that's my treasure for the day. Discovered something that really appeals to my funny mind.
Yeah, I thought that was fun. I read that, and it's just like, really? 4 different terms for a girl between 11 and 12 and a half. That's so. And so she was over 12 and 1 day and under 12 and a half.
Might it be that it's actually a way of delineating how she interacts with the rest of the community?
Oh yeah, it would be. Yeah, because I suppose at 12 and a half, she'd have had her about whatever the female equivalent of bar mitzvah is.
Well, there probably wasn't. The whole question of bar mitzvah is a bit odd. There probably wasn't a bat mitzvah, which is the daughter of the law. That comes along later, and it's it may have existed in some places before, but it tends to happen with Reform Judaism.
If they're that specific with the language, and the language is from that era, there must have been some transition, because if you're that specific about the language, there would have been some symbolism around the transition. Most people say that there wasn't a bar mitzvah, but often we're talking about what happened after AD 70 with the loss of the temple. Now, it is clear that the first time a son in the family, when he's about 12, goes up at Passover, I have heard it said that he travels up on that particular occasion with the women and children, and then at that, then he will be required to be the one to present the lamb for the Passover. That's the first time, and at that point, he's transitioned to an adult, and when they return at the end of Passover, he doesn't travel back with the women and children, he travels back with the men. So, in effect, he's made the change which we talk about in a bar mitzvah. So that would tie into when Jesus went up to the temple and they lost him. So that would be part of the confusion. That where is he?
He's now with the other lot.
He should have been traveling with the men, but they didn't realize he wasn't with them. And who was he traveling with? And then they realized he wasn't with any of them. He was still at the temple. Yeah,
but there does seem to be a bit of foggy stuff around all that question. So I do wonder whether we've actually got to the bottom of those sorts of questions. You know me, I'm always ferreting away in the earth at the roots of these things. And I just feel, different people saying different things, and you think, well, this seems to fit, but is it another of those stories like a camel getting through a little gate, which in fact isn't right at all? That's a complete urban myth or whatever, So I still have it's parked and I'm digging away in it. But there's a little point here again. Went in where the child was, taking her by the hand, he said, Talitha Kumi. Now that's Aramaic, right? And again, this is something I'm unraveling, but it does seem that Aramaic, which is a Hebrew-related language, pops up at certain times in the Gospels, and there's a lot of debate. Were the Gospels originally written Hebrew? Were they originally written in Greek? Were they written in Aramaic? And if you go to the different schools, they'll give you very solid reasons why it's whichever one they back. And I've come to the conclusion that, and I haven't heard anybody else say this, so this is just Edmund, all right? But I've come to the conclusion, someone was explaining that at home, in the family space, the normal language spoken in Galilee would be Aramaic. That's among the family, like some Scots will chatter Gaelic up in the Hebrides, you know. But on the street, Greek would be very much more common. And then, depending on what you were doing, Hebrew, and if you're doing legal documents, Latin. And it seems to me, here they are in the private space of Jairus and his family, and the language which she, if that's true, that's the language she's most accustomed to. And Jesus at certain times uses Aramaic. And so that strikes me. And if you look at the other Gospels, this bit actually sorted out a problem for me. Sometimes Christians will talk about that when we die, we sleep, and when we open our eyes, that's going to be at the resurrection. Well, that wasn't the position I used to hold, but I went to the funeral of a very good friend of mine, and church just like ours, and yet the pastor was saying we had a meeting after they'd buried him. And suddenly in the middle of his thing, he said, "Oh, well, we've left Martin up on the hill. He's now sleeping. And when he next opens his eyes, that'll be the last trumpet." And I was a bit startled because I wasn't used to that idea. And then I began to see all these words as I read through in my normal reading about sleeping. And I thought, oh, I must have got this wrong. And then I began to see other verses which said not sleeping. And I struggled with that. And then it was sorted out when I saw absent from the body, present with the Lord. And I realised that every occasion in the New Testament where it talks about sleeping, the context is always the physical. And the spirit is to do with relationship with God or whatever. And so it fits them both together perfectly well. The body sleeps. And if you read the account in Luke of this, it says, there's an extra phrase. It said, he says to a little girl, "Arise," or whatever, and her spirit returned. The spirit was gone, but it came back. And so I always like this, because when people ask the questions about that, I always take them to that passage.
There you go. I thought you were going to get into deep water there right at the end of our meeting. Because we are now out of time. Yeah, and it's in Luke 8:55. It says, "My child, get up, her spirit returned, and at once she stood up." And interestingly, in contrast to the demoniac and in contrast to the public healing of the woman, Jesus tells the parents not to tell anybody. Gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. So, and on that, we will end. So thank you for coming, everyone. I'm just going to turn off the recording.